Welcome everyone to week 5's pre-recorded lecture on self and community identity. This is our third of 6 key concepts. We've already looked at in week 3 power, our first key concept, on which I asked all of you to make a blog. And then you got to choose one more key concept to blog on before the end of week 8 when we're finished with our first module of this subject. So in week 3 we looked at power, our first key concept. In week 4 we looked at space and place, our second key concept. In week 5, we're looking at self and community identity, and this will then lead us to be thinking about narrative and communication in week 6. In week 7, we're going to be thinking about reality and virtuality, and week 8, we're going to be thinking about exchange. And those are the series of our key concepts module, and then we're going to move into our second module, and we try to apply these key concepts to some global networks that we'll analyze in real life. And we'll revisit these key concepts again, but try harder to apply them to some case studies. So welcome to week 5. I know that we've been having some technical difficulties, and I've really appreciated a number of you who've been reaching out with your own difficulties as well. One of the things that we try really hard to do in BA1002 is to try to reach you wherever you're at and support you through not just this subject, but give you tools to help you through your entire degree. So I just continue to invite you to reach out to your teaching team if you're encountering some difficulties as we progress our way through into midterm. It's not too late to catch up if you feel you're falling behind or if you're confused and you need some help. So please always feel that that invitation is open to you. Right, so today's lecture is going to follow the following structure. We're going to start with an introduction like we normally do, where we complexify our everyday notions of what normally seems to us a very straightforward concept, identity. And we're going to do that by thinking about both our online identities and our offline identities. And then we're going to move through a 3-part structure where we're going to look at a brief history of ideas about identity in history. Then we're going to be looking at social theories of identity, just the most prominent ones. And then in part 3, we're going to try to apply some of these theories to ideas about self or community identity as we may see it playing out on the internet. So let's get started with our lecture introduction. These are just some memes that I've grabbed from the internet. If you search identity or anything like that on a Google image search, you will find heaps of these kinds of memes, and you've probably seen them circulate yourself on your own social media accounts. And I just want to draw attention to a few key things about them. First of all, the first one at the top corner of our left talks about the fact that we know for sure on social media there are actually fake accounts, right? There are actually, accounts that are owned and managed by real people or teams of real people. Social media teams is an increasing phenomenon we might want to think about. But then we know there are explicitly fake accounts. So this was some meme that I found, I think just last year, and it said there are 1.3 billion Facebook accounts and 170 million of them are fake. And I would hazard to guess that actually the proportion of them is much higher. We don't know what the actual fact checking is on this. And this is talking about things like phishing, P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. I think we all know what that is, when someone actually pretends to be someone else and lures you into their social media world for romantic purposes or purposes of extorting money or any other purposes at all. And I sometimes confess that in the early days of Facebook, just to sort of play around with it as a tool, I opened a Facebook account under just a made-up name and a made-up email address, and uploaded a easily available picture and put a different name to it just to see what would happen. And it was really interesting experiment in working out how different someone else's Facebook account might look like from the one that I had carefully curated in my own community. But just kind of like what the Wild West of the internet looks like if you're kind of just bumbling into it. And it really makes us aware that what the internet world looks like from my perspective, where I am in my space and community and place, will look very different from anyone else's. And that's simply to illustrate that we are all located in our own communities, and our location, whether geographically or in hyperspace or otherwise, frames our perspective. So there's a couple points that I've made there about the difference between explicitly fake accounts versus real accounts, but also the way in which we form our social media identities, whether explicitly, consciously curating them to cultivate certain kinds of communities or not, makes them very different from other people's social media accounts. Even though we may think these are representations of the world, they're representations of the world from our perspective. So that's one simple point to make about identity that locates it in place and space on the internet or otherwise. And then there's the way we can sometimes talk about people being just fake on the internet, and people calling you out for being a fake person in reality, whether you're a person who, gets extension eyelashes, extension hair, whatever, however, people can say, oh, you're fake or you're authentic. And we might need to unpack what that means in more sophisticated terms than get thrown around in everyday life. And let's look at these other memes. Everyone's seen these sorts of kinds of memes circulate on the internet. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, or there's the internet you versus the, it's just like Bruce Willis from Die Hard, and he's super buff and tough and edited. And then there's the real world you, who's like really like kind of flabby and not tough at all. And this is talking about the public you to a certain extent versus the you who you are in private. And sometimes the you are on the internet may be, as in the Bruce Willis meme, a more pronounced fantasy version of yourself. Or in this other meme we have here of this girl who looks pristine in public. She's clearly a mess on the internet, full of anger, and she's a keyboard warrior hiding in anonymity. And that's really addressing ways we can be a projection of our ideal self, or we can use the anonymity of the internet to conceal perhaps our less ideal self, but a self who is driven by appetites, for example. And then on the last one, we have this idea of, when you're home alone, you can really be your real self, like who you want to be with your cape on and eating your Captain Crunch and, being something that's, sort of not the norm, however you want to be. And we've all, I think, experienced a version of that during COVID as well. When we suddenly forced online, it's like, okay, Victoria says, come on Zoom, camera ready, with all your makeup on and everything. And it's just like a really interesting concept where suddenly we're forced on the internet to be a public persona from our homes, which we perhaps once considered private spaces, where we could dress in our PJs and be anything we wanted to be. So even just when we start to think about these basic ideas about identity, the real person versus the fake person, the ideal versus the, repressed, appetite-driven person, the person alone versus the person in community, the person who's explicitly fake versus the person who's just cultivated a persona in a particular way, we can see that identity is a much more complicated concept than just something quite straightforward. So one of the exercises I asked you to do in your tutorial guide this week was to think about if an alien arrived on planet Earth and didn't speak English, and you needed to explain to them this concept called identity, and they're really struggling with this concept. How would you define that? And if you were following our Collaborate, you would see that a number of people identified it as just me, or various different things. And we could see it was kind of giving us all trouble to define this. And of course, people who speak more than one language will know that language is packed with concepts that sometimes aren't translatable easily because they're filled with nuance. And different languages interpret these ideas in different ways. And that's something we'll continue on thinking about next week when we talk about narrative and communication. So identity isn't as straightforward as we think. And even trying to explain it using language can be really complicated because language, as we'll learn today, has something to do with how we think about ourselves and how we form ideas about self too. So let's move through then this sort of more complex idea of self. And again, this is still just the lecture introduction. Now, as I suggested in the last slide, when I give students that task of trying to explain who they are to an alien, or even the concept of identity to an alien, they usually just say, it's me, or it's self, or they'll start giving me cognate terms of that. But One of the ways some of the earliest Greek philosophers began to trouble that very straightforward notion of self is with this notion of solipsism, which was a kind of existential philosophy before there was the term existentialism, but a philosophy about the existence of self, or how we experience ourselves in the world. And it was related to a branch of philosophy called Sophism. And a solipsist, or the solipsistic dilemma, is one that's troubled philosophers for a very long time. And that is that there's a proposition that solipsists make, that the premise of solipsism makes, which is that it is impossible to demonstrate that existence is actually real. Moreover, it's even harder to demonstrate that other people are real. So it was a branch of philosophy that basically says that nothing can be known except one's own existence, or our impressions of our own existence. So that the idea is that even if something does exist out there, it might just be a dream. Nothing can really be known about it. And even if something could be known about it, you could communicate that knowledge to others. So the idea of the solipsist dilemma is, it's kind of like the Truman Show, right? Or we've seen versions of this, like in The Matrix, right? For example, the idea that there's this sort of like fantasy world out there, whether it's created by an evil government or something you've dreamed up or a TV production, and your own existence is kind of trapped within it, and there's no way that you can prove that it's real. So most of us think we know who we are, even if we're in the throes of an identity crisis. But the solipsistic dilemma basically says that's not true. We can't really know that we exist, and we certainly cannot definitively prove that our experience is just not a dream, right? Like, it's not just something that we're fantasizing. And when I throw this out to people, a lot of people say, well, I can definitely prove that I exist and I'm not just a fantasy of your imagination, because if I took a gun right now and I shot you, your fantasy would end. And therefore you would know that I had an actual effect on your existence and I was real and you weren't just dreaming me. But of course, what a solipsist would then return with would be the response that, well, I've had dreams like that. How can I not know that that's also just not a part of my dream?